Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mike. You guys are rocking with me on Mike's Intellectual Corner. On today's episode, we are diving into a new series. This is real life lore. This is every country England has invaded, visualized. Without further ado, we're just going to dive right into it. Let's go.
This video is made possible by CuriosityStream. Watch all of my videos early and ad-free, or watch my upcoming original series exclusively on Nebula, which you can get access to for $15 a year through the bundled deal at curiositystream.com/reallifelore. For a good chunk of the past few centuries, this music was the final boss music played for people across the entire world. The English and later the British have been responsible for invading and conquering more countries and people than any other nation in human history. And honestly, it's startling just how many places they've been to. In this video, I'm going to do my best at attempting to visualize all of Britain's invasions and conquests for you, continent by continent, in as brief a time as possible. So let's
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, it definitely helps that they had the most elite navy for freaking almost a millennia. Not even, I think around 1300 they didn't even have a navy like that. But for almost like 500, 600, 700 years, they had this elite navy. On top of the fact that they were the very first country to industrialize, being able to make like weapons en masse. You know what I'm saying, for their massive army and stuff like that. So it definitely helps.
In as brief a time as possible. So let's begin with the closest continent to Britain, Europe. Ireland was the first target of British conquests and was invaded as early as 1169. Within 400 years of gradual conquests, the entire island was ruled by the British and remained that way until most of it was granted independence in 1921.
And it's funny too, because I feel like as far as the UK goes, there might be a few more countries added to this list of invaded countries. And I doubt that it'll ever happen, but if say Scotland and Wales wants their independence and want to be their own independent country, then obviously we have to add those to the list too.
In 1921. Historically, France has probably been invaded by the English more times than any other country in the world. Just take a look at this huge list of invasions. There's not even enough time to talk about a third of these, and for a time, all of this territory inside of modern France was directly controlled by the English, with Calais being the final piece that fell in 1557. Well, except for that time when the British took over Corsica for a couple years. The British continue to invade Spain by the millions every winter, but in the past, they've come with a lot less friendly intentions. English and later British soldiers invaded under the Black Prince in 1367 and continued on through the First, Second,
and I feel like we're going to see a lot of 17 and 1800s dates in these, obviously because of Napoleonic Wars. They were just all throughout freaking Europe and stuff.
On through the First, Second, Third, and Fourth raids on Cadiz and that time when the British took over Gibraltar and Minorca. They gave Minorca back, but decided on keeping Gibraltar forever. In recent history, the British have invaded Belgium in order to support the Belgians. But that wasn't always the case. They conducted two pretty large-scale invasions of modern-day Belgium in 1654 and again in 1701. And Flanders itself was ruled by the English for a few years in the 14th century. The Netherlands was one of England's historical arch rivals.
Yeah, and I feel like you can really put the entire continent of Europe up there. Cause I feel like he's only doing invasive or friendly invasions, but if you want to put friendly invasions, you can put the entire continent of Europe up there, really, because obviously World War I and World War II, so.
Historical arch rivals, and so there's been plenty of invasions going in this direction across the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1940, the British technically invaded and took over Iceland peacefully for a year in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Germans. But this was heavily protested by the Icelandic government at the time, so in my books it still counts as an invasion. Italy, of course, was invaded by the British Army during the Second World War as well in 1943, but there were plenty of invasions before then, dating back to Richard the Lionheart's invasion in 1190. Germany, too, was obviously invaded by the British Army in 1945, and northwestern Germany was occupied by the British for 3 years until 1948. But a lot of German territory was ruled by Britain long before then. The islands of Heligoland were British for most of the 19th century, and the Kingdom of Hanover was effectively ruled under a personal union for over a century between 1714 and 1837.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, that's actually where King George III was born. The king that was king, obviously, during the American Revolution and stuff like that. That's where he was born. Was Hanover, if I'm not mistaken, because that's why I was doing some type of research for, I think, for my Today in History, and that's where it said that he was born. And I was like, he was born in Germany, but he's a English. Well, obviously that's why he's English king, because he owned it at the time.
And 1837. Austria was also invaded in 1945, and the southwest of the country was occupied for a decade. Norway was invaded in 1810 and 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars when it was a part of Denmark-Norway because Denmark was aligned to France, so obviously Denmark was invaded during that time as well. Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were all briefly invaded by small units during the Crimean War against Russia because they were all part of the Russian Empire at the time, and of course, Russia itself was invaded then too, as well as in 1918 when the British took over a large chunk of northern Russia for a time in their fight against the Bolsheviks.
Which is crazy too, because I feel like every single Allied country sent like an expeditionary force over there during World War One, while they still had boots on the ground in Europe. They sent more troops into Russia to help with the Civil War and stuff like that, including America and all that. So.
Their fight against the Bolsheviks. The territory of modern Ukraine was invaded by British army units during the Crimean War. The British took over the Croatian island of Vis between 1807 and 1814 during their fight against Napoleon. The British army had boots and guns on the ground in Bosnia recently between 1992 and 95, fighting against the Bosnian Serbs, and around the same time, the RAF also carried out bombing strikes against Serbian Serb targets in Serbia in 1999. Montenegro was briefly blockaded and invaded in 1913 during the First Balkan War. The British owned the westernmost Ionian islands of Greece between 1815 and 1863 before they gave them back, while Bulgaria was invaded and almost entirely occupied by the British Army between 1918 and 1919.
Yeah, see, and I feel like it kind of helps that, or a lot of these countries that were invaded off of being involved in, like, say, another war like the Crimean War or the, just different stuff like that.
By the British Army between 1918 and 1919 at the end of World War I. Cyprus was a British protectorate between 1878 and 1914 when they decided to just outright annex it to piss off the Turks, and it remained annexed until 19...
Yeah, and Cyprus is, I think, how they annexed Cyprus is kind of funny because it's kind of petty in my opinion, because they literally annexed it the same day that they declared war on the Ottoman Empire. So it's like, we're gonna snatch this up because we already know that you're probably gonna try to take it, so we're gonna be petty and take it before you do. I just thought that was kind of funny.
Turks, and it remained annexed until 1960, except for two small chunks that are still British today. Turkey itself was massively invaded by the British during World War I, and part of it was occupied between 1919 and 1923. That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to Asia next. Modern-day Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan, were British-controlled from the end of World War I to 1948 and 1946, respectively. Lebanon and Syria were both occupied from the Vichy French government briefly during World War II. Iraq was ruled between 1919 and 1932 and invaded again during the Second World War, and again in 1991, and again in 2003. Kuwait was a colony for over 60 years until 1966. Georgia and Azerbaijan were both invaded and occupied right at the end of World War I for a year. Iran has been invaded at least 3 times, with the most notable example being the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941. Turkmenistan was invaded in 1918 to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading any further. Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot.
Yeah, see, you can't get mad at Americans for being involved in everybody else's crap and being the world police and being involved in the Middle East, because British were doing it years before we ever stepped foot over there, so, you know what I'm saying?
Spreading any further. Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot since it's been invaded in 1839, 1878, 1919, and again in 2001. Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman were all controlled by the British until the early 1970s, while a chunk of Yemen was controlled for over a century between 1839 and 1967. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were all, of course, invaded many times and outright ruled by the British Empire in parts for nearly 2 centuries between 1757 and 1947. Nepal was invaded in 1814 but never successfully conquered.
And I think that's kind of crazy too, because I feel like Nepal is kind of a place that is just really, it's kind of impossible to conquer because those mountains. There's so many cities inside of those freaking huge mountains, inside the mountains up there. You you can't conquer them all. I just feel like it's impossible. Not to mention have an entire army walking through that type of altitude. You're just going to lose too many, personally. So I feel like that Nepal is kind of like Afghanistan, just never got to be conquered. It's just one of those things.
Successfully conquered. Bhutan was invaded in 1772 and again in 1864, and was sort of conquered as a protectorate between 1910 and 1948. Burma/Myanmar was invaded in 1826 and was definitely successfully conquered and ruled through 1947. Thailand was briefly invaded in 1945 since they were allied to Japan in World War II, and so was Vietnam in the same year, but that was to support the French government against the growing independence movement. Malaysia and Singapore were each conquered and ruled up until the 1950s and 1960s. Brunei was conquered and ruled up until the 1980s, whereas the Philippines were briefly invaded during the 7 Years' War. China got invaded a lot, and Hong Kong was a colony until as recently as 1997. And while not outright invaded, part of Japan was occupied following World War II between 1946 and 1952.
Actually, he needed to go ahead and put South Korea up there too, because, well, all of Korea, South and North Korea, because I'm pretty sure they were a part of the joint effort to reconquer South Korea whenever North Korea tried to take it, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm pretty sure they were a pretty big part of that with us.
1946 and 1952. And finally, Indonesia was invaded a bunch during the Napoleonic Wars since it was a Dutch colony aligned to France at the time. Next up, Oceania. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were invaded by the British and established as colonies that each gained independence in 1931. Papua New Guinea was also a British colony for a time, as were the
And now, of course, thanks to Al Murray, whenever I hear Papua New Guinea, all I think of is Papa has a brand new Guinea.
the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move back over to Africa next, which the British have violently visited a lot. In terms of just places the British outright colonized after invasions, there's the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, along with parts of modern-day Somalia and Guinea. Senegal was briefly invaded and had some of their coastline taken over in the 1700s, while during the Second World War, the British invaded the French colonies of Djibouti, Madagascar, and Comoros after they aligned themselves with the Nazi Vichy regime, and the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, although they had also invaded Ethiopia much earlier in 1868. And as German colonies right before World War I, the British also invaded Togo and Cameroon without annexing them afterwards. For the final area.
Well, shouldn't Lesbos, I think that's the name of it, Lesbos, and the little country that's in the middle of South Africa, shouldn't that be there too? Because that was a part of South Africa at one point, and then they got their independence. But
Afterwards. For the final area of the world left to discuss, let's move over to the Americas. All of Canada was a British colony until 1931, while Newfoundland remained until 1949. The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776, and was invaded again in 1812, and the modern states of Oregon and Washington were claimed right up until 1846. As far as other outright British colonies here go, there was the Bahamas, Jamaica, Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Besides colonies, Cuba was invaded and occupied during the 7 Years' War in 1762. Haiti was invaded in 1793 during the French Revolutionary Wars.
yeah, they're all over the islands. I'm sure the islanders were probably pretty damn sick of that. Sick of seeing them and that British flag out there after a while. You can tell.
During the French Revolutionary Wars, the Dominican Republic was invaded way back in 1655 in an attempt at conquest under Oliver Cromwell. Parts of the east coast of Honduras and Nicaragua were conquered and ruled for nearly 2 centuries until 1819. They sent the Navy to invade Mexico in 1861 to force them to repay some debts, and during the splendidly named War of Jenkins' Year, aka the more lame-sounding War of the Austrian Succession, the British invaded a lot of Spain's colonies, including Panama, a huge one into Colombia, and ultimately Peru. In 1796, the British took over Suriname because it was a Dutch colony, and they were allied with the revolutionary French and later Napoleon. They also invaded Martinique and Guadeloupe because they actually were French during the Napoleonic Wars. Venezuela was invaded in 1902 as part of the so-called Venezuela crisis.
Yeah, I feel like pre-World War II, the Great Britain was definitely the world police, obviously, and then after World War II, we just, for some reason, I don't know why, but we took that role on. Essentially, almost feels like exactly like how they did, except we just have more bases and stuff all over the damn place. But yeah.
The so-called Venezuela crisis to force the country to repay some debts they had defaulted on, kind of like Mexico, while Argentina and Uruguay were both invaded during the Napoleonic Wars as well in 1806 when Spain and her colonies were still allied with Napoleon. And that pretty much sums up all of the territory the British have ever ruled and all of the countries this small island has ever invaded. There are a total of 65 countries today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire. The Empire used to rule over a quarter of all the world's land at the same time and was the biggest empire in human history. And in total, today, there have been 117 modern countries that have been aggressively invaded by the British Armed Forces during some point in their histories, representing a total of 60% of all the world's nations, which is almost the same number of countries that you can watch this.
Which is crazy though. Alright, we're gonna end it there because I can tell the end of the video. But it's kind of crazy too because obviously we can put a lot more countries on here because obviously he didn't shade in Denmark and Norway like he mentioned them, and obviously he also he didn't mention Greece or anything like that. But obviously we know that they invaded Greece in World War II and stuff like that. But hey, you guys again for joining me on another episode of the Micah's Intellectual Corner. I'll see you guys on another one. I'm out. Peace.